Test, test, test. Excellent. Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you'll be able to get some coffee. We'll wake up, we'll talk about crime, we'll talk about all the terrible things people are saying about crypto, and we'll end on a high note. Briefly, just my background, like why I got into this. So my day job is I look at cybersecurity and geopolitical risk, advise multinationals. I've been supporting BPI for several years now, looking at the intersection of Bitcoin, geopolitics, and national security. I'd like to everyone to sort of give a bit of a deeper dive on your background, because I think that'll help sort of resonate the messages you want to talk about today.
Sure, nice to see you all. Just warning, you have a panel of fast talkers, so we kind of upside, promise to keep ourselves at a reasonable pace. So wave at us if we're getting too excited. My name is Ken Egan. I'm currently head of operations at BlockTrace. We do blockchain analytics for government clients, mostly federal law enforcement. Previously, I'm a retired senior operations officer at CIA. I spent most of my career overseas, but in my last 4 years, I served at CIA's Center for Cyber Intelligence, which is CIA's cyber arm.
Hey everyone, my name is Sam Lyman. I'm Director of Public Policy at Riot Platforms. My background, I started my career several years on the Hill as a speechwriter. Then I was at the US Chamber of Commerce as a speechwriter. In both of these roles, there was a lot of overlap with crypto and illicit finance. Spent some time at a think tank, then really dived deep into crypto and Bitcoin policy when I was at grad school. Began writing about digital assets for Forbes, and started with Riot about 8 months ago.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Meredith Fitzpatrick. I am the Director of Cryptocurrency Investigations and Compliance at Forensic Risk Alliance. We are an international consulting firm that specializes in forensic accounting investigations, and I lead their cryptocurrency investigations practice. Up until last year, I was a special agent at the FBI. I spent the entirety of my career in the FBI investigating criminal and nation-state computer intrusion cases and cryptocurrency money laundering. Did the first 5 years of my career on the criminal side of the house, and then the back half, I led a very large Russian state-sponsored investigation. I was part of a small group looking at how the Russian intelligence agencies were laundering their crypto before they used it to purchase infrastructure or evade sanctions. Then I was also on the FBI's virtual currency response team, where we served as subject matter experts for the FBI's largest cryptocurrency cases.
Excellent. So as you can tell, we've got exactly the right people on this panel to kind of address this question head on. And I think before we start getting into sort of the policy ramifications and the kind of the current debates in Washington that we're all familiar with, I think it's very helpful just to like level set some definitions, kind of the taxonomy of what do we mean when we say crypto, and what do we mean when we say illicit finance? Because I think you can decompose each of those things into important distinctions that have like a critical bearing on the right policy tools and the right sort of racking and stacking of the relevant threat for national security. So Ken, you want to start just by sort of unpacking, especially from a blockchain analytics perspective, like how you think about crypto and its intersection with different types of illicit finance?
Sure, I think it's helpful to sort of outline what we talk about illicit finance, but that's a very broad arc of what is illicit finance, right? You go from the baseline of people being, unfortunate people being sent to cryptocurrency ATMs to pay off, bills, all the way through the unfortunately named pig butchering, which are essentially romance scams at scale, a significant problem, and then money laundering, of course, which is sort of bigger crime. But from there, you move into what are essentially criminal activities to what at least I personally view as illicit finance that has a state angle to it, namely ransomware. And then, of course, there's North Korea, right? There's hacking at scale. And all of these, I think, require different policies. They all have different policy implications and require different policy responses.
Excellent. Meredith, so from your perspective, prosecuting these cases, investigating these cases for prosecution, like what did you see up close that maybe you think policymakers weren't aware of? And like what is the racking and stacking in your mind of like the relevant dimensions of this problem that matter the most versus the ones that you think are overblown?
Mm-hmm. So I think that there is traditional fraud that now has a cryptocurrency angle to it. So take FTX, for example. That is a straight up fraud case. It just happens to deal with the cryptocurrency exchange. There's also the nation state angle, as Ken mentioned. So as far as the ones that are the most economically devastating and most worrisome from a national security perspective, DPRK is certainly at the top of the list. And then there's also what is the most, everyday American citizens, like what's the most economically dangerous for that. And that like pig butchering and investment fraud scams they're one away from them. I think when you hear people talk about people using crypto to remain anonymous and evade detection. I think at this point it's well known that Bitcoin is certainly not anonymous, that law enforcement does have very good, and investigative firms do have very good tools and expertise to investigate these crimes. But when you're thinking about like the true black belts of people that are they're using an over-the-counter trader to either on-ramp or off-ramp. They're using DeFi protocols to rapidly switch between cryptocurrencies. They're using privacy coins. They're using, a DEX aggregator such as like a 1inch, and then they're also using an over-the-counter trader to go, take all their laundered crypto and then go into fiat. Does that happen? Yes, but that is extraordinarily technically, and then also add in, self-custodial wallets. Like, does that happen? Yes, but like those are the black belts of money laundering. Like that is not the vast majority of criminals, and that's why I think the U.S. government has been able to effect these very splashy seizures, because a lot, that is very hard and not. It's a very, very small proportion of illicit actors that have the technical wherewithal to do all that in conjunction.
So obviously, there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes that isn't visible, that isn't published on op-eds, or doesn't sort of make the news, or doesn't become the subject of kind of sort of political letters, which brings me to Sam. Obviously, probably the most salient story in this topic for the past 6-9 months has been the sort of Wall Street Journal article, the Senator Elizabeth Warren's letter, and the associated kind of debate over what was the data that went into that? Was that correct data? Is this U.S. policy being based on sort of made up numbers? Could you kind of dig into that as like a really useful case study to think about how bad data can inform either good or bad policy?
For sure. They say bad intel can get halfway across the world before the truth has a chance to put its pants on. Sometimes it can find its way all the way to the Oval Office, and that's what happened last fall. So last fall, you saw this very splashy headline in the Wall Street Journal of Hamas raising over $130 million in cryptocurrency to fund its operations, specifically its terrorist attack against Israel. For all of us in the industry, we were shocked because this was huge news to us, and we started digging deeper into the data, and we realized to get that really sensational headline, a game of telephone took place, and there were 3 players involved in this game of telephone. There was one blockchain analytics firm which made very aggressive claims months prior about how much cryptocurrency Hamas had fundraised. And then that information was passed on to journalists who extrapolated that data incorrectly. And then that false data was then used by politicians to advance their own political agenda. And so it went just from party to party to party until all of a sudden you had a letter penned by Elizabeth Warren and signed by over 100 other members of Congress sent to the White House saying that crypto is a national security threat and that over $130 million had been fundraised to finance Hamas's operations in Israel. So after this had happened, the industry, we just went to an all hands on deck mode where we looked deeper into the blockchain analytics. And first of all, the source that was cited by Wall Street Journal as having been the initial source for that $130 million figure, they came out and refuted it and said, no, this is a complete misinterpretation of the data. After that, TRM Labs, Chainalysis, the leading blockchain analytics firms in the fields, they also refuted the claims that had been made. And the proof is in the pudding because this is the blockchain. Almost everything is there for people to see going back as long as Bitcoin has existed. And so that was a really important time for our industry to help lawmakers understand you can make claims against us that are sensational, but we can refute them with the facts. That's the beauty of the blockchain itself. And so thankfully the facts surfaced. It took a couple weeks after for certain publications to come out and show what really happened. And then that figure was eventually refuted by Undersecretary Nelson. He's Undersecretary at the Treasury who oversees these issues. He refuted these facts, or supposed facts, just a few weeks ago when he himself admitted, yes, those claims were sensational, they weren't true. And so an entire letter and political agenda had been based on what essentially was fake news.
And obviously this is a narrative story. It's a debate in sort of the pages of news magazines and kind of the discourse in the halls of Congress. But Meredith, does this have an effect on the actual law enforcement prioritization? Does this have an effect on how we actually go after the things we need to go after?
It does. So There's an alternate universe where, the intelligence agencies, that is their mission in life, is to understand the data across the globe and turn it into intelligence to inform policymakers. I think that there's also an alternate universe where that data can then inform priorities. I think when you have one of the biggest travesties of a story like that, is looking at Hamas's use of using crypto to fundraise. Is that important to look at? Absolutely. However, when you have numbers that come out that are not correct, that does, and then Senator Warren goes off on a rampage, that can influence priorities that get pushed to other agencies. And so that is where, and then the downside effect of that is that you have, you're all of a sudden told this, all these resources that were being devoted to one priority, we now need to shift them over, when maybe the numbers behind, who are actually the most egregious threat actors out there, that wouldn't necessarily be the case. So I think that's the other that's the other concern when a story like that comes out that's not based in real numbers.
Yeah, Ken, from your perspective, obviously on the law enforcement side, this is critical to how we investigate and prosecute cases. Obviously, in the intelligence community, their successes are invisible. Only your failures are known. So how does this dynamic also play out when it comes to, okay, we are on the front lines, we see what different threat actors are using these tools for, and yet there's a political conversation that doesn't align with those activities, with those priorities. How do you sort of manage that friction? Do policymakers understand where the sources of expertise on these questions lie within the federal government, and instead of pursuing a political objective, actually responding to the experts that are working on this day to day?
I think so. I think, to put it in perspective, it's instructive to sort of go back in time a little bit to the days of Silk Road, the OG of darknet markets, and where, as one prominent banker described it, Bitcoin earned its reputation as an index of criminality. So these are the early days of Bitcoin. If you look at Silk Road on chain, millions of Bitcoin were transacted, enormous amounts of money, godly amounts of money in today's dollars. And all of this happened before federal law enforcement or any law enforcement even the intelligence community had the tools to deal with, to effectively monitor blockchain activity. 10 years later, as we walk through the 2010s, the industry pops up as cryptocurrency in general, Bitcoin, gains popularity. Industry pops up, right, blockchain analytics, to provide government law enforcement the tools they need to be able to effectively monitor and prosecute crime where they found it. Some 10 years later, people that transacted on Silk Road are still being prosecuted. I think people at the time didn't really recognize when you press broadcast transaction, it's forever. Just as one example, a case my company worked on, Jimmy Zong, stole 50,000 Bitcoin from Silk Road. In 2022, he was convicted. The government seized 50,000 Bitcoin, some $3.7 billion. So I think it's important to, because I think the people who describe Bitcoin in particular as sort of optimized for criminal activity, there's recency bias there, right? Yes, Bitcoin was and still is used for criminal activity, but is it optimized for it? And I think that, as someone referred to earlier, the fact that the U.S. government is the largest Bitcoin whale, it's not because the U.S. government is mining Bitcoin, it's not because it's buying Bitcoin, because it's seizing Bitcoin. It's seizing Bitcoin derived from illegal activity. And I think that very fact belies the notion that it is actually optimized or effective tool for criminal activity.
So I want to go back to almost to the beginning and pick up on the point that you just brought up, which is the taxonomy and the distribution of use cases that we see emerging also changes rapidly as the cryptocurrency ecosystem changes rapidly. And so what would you say, Meredith and Sam, in terms of your conversations with policymakers in terms of disambiguating, for example, the North Koreans, Lazarus Group, just stealing and then laundering funds, not necessarily, the traditional hacks that we saw before, state actors started to get involved. And you had $600 million essentially being stolen, used to support weapons of mass destruction programs. Like a clear, that's not good from American national security perspective.
Bad.
Versus,
bad.
Okay, some guys selling drugs, right? Or making, small ball transactions. There are things that truly matter, and there is a large universe of things that don't matter as much. But from a national security perspective, we need to prioritize and develop the right tools to go after, say, DeFi protocols that are not, using proper security, that don't have essentially basic due diligence on who they're hiring, and they're just, turns out maybe they just hired a North Korean to hold all their keys. Probably not good. So it's like I think there's things from the national security perspective where you look at an industry, you say, well, these are just own goals. Like, can you help us? And I think that's a prudent argument. But also sort of casting a broad brush and saying this entire industry is basically just a den of thieves, bad guys doing bad things with this tool, therefore the tool is bad. Does that resonate? Sam, I'll start with you. Kind of your conversations with policymakers. What has been like the main stumbling block in terms of just getting out the gate and addressing this issue?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. The very first thing people jump to if they have preconceived notions about Bitcoin that are negative is, for example, North Korea, right? So what we try to help them recognize is that Bitcoin is a national security asset, not a national security liability. There are so many use cases for Bitcoin, for example, in special operations that probably can't go into detail on that, but there are use cases that our own US military has for Bitcoin in the field. In addition to that, we have to recognize that what's driving this bull cycle right now, it's this narrative of institutional adoption. What will drive the upcoming bull cycle? It's going to be the narrative of nation-state adoption. And as Ken pointed out, the United States, we don't do national Bitcoin mining, but we do Bitcoin seizures better than anybody else in the world, right? And for that reason, Bitcoin, the US is one of the biggest Bitcoin whales in the world. And we need to recognize this is an emerging monetary network, the fastest growing monetary network in the world. And we want to be at the forefront of that. We need to continue to have a stake in the Bitcoin mining network, because if Bitcoin mining is banned from the US, where's it going to go? It's going to go to places like North Korea, Kazakhstan, places where they don't care all about using renewable energy for Bitcoin mining and keeping it clean. Whereas here in the United States, we do care about that. Over 50% of the energy that is used for Bitcoin mining actually comes from renewable sources. So it's helping people understand that, first of all, it's a national security asset and will be more and more in the future. In addition to that, there are many energy positive externalities related to energy that comes with Bitcoin mining as well.
Meredith, I was going to ask you a follow-up. I wanted to end this last point to tease up stable coins in particular, because we talked about this before. As again, the shifting dynamics in terms of the industry and then how bad actors want to exploit the industry for their own illicit means, there seems to, and I think it's objectively true, like a shift in use of stablecoins, right? Obviously, stablecoins have become like an increasingly powerful force in the digital asset ecosystem, and that has created a large surface area for bad actors to exploit. Like in your experience, kind of how does that fit in, and like what are you seeing happen right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think the data that comes out of companies like Chainalysis and TRM supports this, that criminal activity is moving away from Bitcoin. But even with that, I mean, it's, again, to foot stomp that it is a national security asset, not a national security liability, is that with the open nature of the blockchain, there's still, as investigators, like me at a private company, or investigators in federal law enforcement agencies, or people at intelligence communities or compliance departments at banks, because you can see the entire financial transaction history of a wallet, you have so much more information to make a compliance or an investigative judgment on. And that, so like one example, like I doing an investigation into a state-sponsored actor. I had 2 servers of interest. One was purchased with a Bitcoin wallet. One was purchased with a credit card where the account went back to Ukraine. With the one we're trying to do the follow the money, who is paying for this server that is responsible for doing bad things. With the credit card that came back to Eastern Europe, it's you have to work with law enforcement partners or intelligence community partners over there, and then find the next bank account, and then find the next bank account. Versus the server that was purchased with crypto, I had the entire financial history of that wallet. I could go back and see a commingling point with other wallets. I could then see, okay, going back to that commingling point, then what are other outbound payments to infrastructure as a service provider? So I just think that, and then also being able to layer on other factors of like, what are other risky entities that that is transacted with, where, if there's any exchanges that it tied back to, what is the IP address login history for those accounts. Like you just have such much more of a richer profile for that. And I think that's when you do talk to more senior officials and you explain that, it does really become true of like, this actually allows us to live at a financially, safer and more empowered world than in the traditional fiat system.
Ken, I wanted to ask you a question about ransomware, which is, I think, an important example that kind of crosses both like our professional domains, like cybersecurity, another professional domain, cryptocurrency, and a third, I think, somewhat discounted domain, which is just geopolitical relations, right? And ransomware has been probably the top of mind policy issue at the National Security Council for the past few years, especially since Colonial Pipeline, and among boards of directors and C-suites and major companies, it's like one of the major sort of threats to a large company. You can wake up any day and all of a sudden have to pay out $10, $20 million, or just have your stuff stolen and have to eat the cost. It's become like a major concern to the point where there's debates about whether national policy needs to change, ban ransom payments, or even use other government authorities to try to impose costs on the adversaries. From your time in government, to what extent is this a crypto problem that the crypto industry and crypto regulation needs to solve versus a national security, geopolitical, White House problem where we need to have much larger conversations about statecraft and how we manage this problem?
No, I think it's a state problem. The cryptocurrency in general, Bitcoin, it's just a tool, right? It's a tool that ransomware actors use to extract payment. I think if, for example, if you were to look at the FBI's most wanted page and look at under cyber criminals, there's a collage of photos of people that tend to come from one geographic area, right? And I have enough professional respect for former adversaries that they understand who they are and where they are, people that end up on the FBI's most wanted page, right? I think that these actors function with at least not the protection, at least the tacit acknowledgement of the states they live in, which is ultimately why law enforcement approaches as they've been traditionally or have not necessarily met with such success. However, I think that as policies evolved, and I think a recognition that this is a state problem, right? I view them as cyber attacks. We call them ransomware. I view them as cyber attacks. You saw recently the FBI was able to disable Lockbit, right, which is one of the most prolific ransomware crews out there. They did a great job. I think it requires a new approach. When you have ransomware actors who are living in states where we have geopolitical problems, right, it's going to be difficult to send MLATs and ask them to extradite them. It's not going to happen. But there are other ways of increasing costs. I think that the approach the government has taken over the past couple of years has recognized that, right? Again, a lot of kudos to FBI for the Lockbit operation. But again, I think this problem won't be fully solved until the United States government is able to come to some arrangement with the countries in which these actors reside.
Excellent. So maybe we'll finish up talking a little bit more tactically in terms of the policy conversation, Sam. So there's been a few bills introduced, amendments discussed around this issue, right? So Senator Warren introduced DAMLA, and then I think just yesterday there was Senator Tillis introduced Enforce Act. There's been other policy discussions around how to think about, in particular, AML KYC as a means of curtailing illicit finance. What would you say is the right way to calibrate the policy response to what is a real issue, but without necessarily sort of overreacting, overreaching, and causing more harm than good?
So the real issue is the use of Bitcoin and crypto in illicit finance. The fix is not to ban crypto and Bitcoin from the United States of America, which is the overprescription that comes from DAML, which is Senator Warren's bill. So effectively, what this bill would do was it would regulate Bitcoin miners, it would regulate validators, it would regulate people mining Bitcoin in their basement the same way that a big bank is regulated in terms of Anti-Money Laundering and Bank Secrecy Act requirements, what they have to report to the US government. So this would drive Bitcoin mining offshore, and again, would drive it to countries who don't care about Bitcoin's environmental impact whatsoever. So that is not workable for our industry whatsoever. However, we have an alternative now, as you mentioned, Matt. That's the Enforce Act. So a discussion draft of that bill was just released a couple days ago. That's from Senator Tillis and Senator Haggerty. That bill seeks to crack down on crypto's use in illicit finance, but it also includes a carve-out for Bitcoin miners, which is essential to our industry. It would allow us to continue to mine Bitcoin here in America and keep America's stake in this growing monetary network. So I'd say DAML, bad bill, Enforce Act, good bill.
Any other thoughts from the panel on the legislative side of things? I know it's not your primary remit, but just from a law enforcement perspective, like when you see the debates happen on the Hill on these things, putting your former law enforcement or IC hat on, do you see that as, connected or peripheral to, those former missions?
I just think there's been a gross overgeneralization. Like, I think a thing with this industry is that it is technically complicated, and it's a lot easier for an elected official to tout a, Bitcoin bad 30-minute talking line than actually learn. And I think when you do, peek under the hood, you see all the technological innovations that this industry promises. And I know from an intelligence and law enforcement perspective, and again, like wanting to create a safer financial system with the open nature of the blockchain and all the different elements that you can layer onto it, I just think you have so much more information at your disposal, and you can make much more informed decisions. The other thing that especially the Hamas story, it's like can you buy guns online with Bitcoin? Yes. Can you buy a huge stash to enough to support an army? Probably not. That's not what you're using cryptocurrency for. And so cryptocurrency money laundering doesn't happen in a vacuum. At some point, there is going to be the transfer and the weave in of traditional money laundering topologies. So I think that's a thing that sometimes gets under my skin when they try to vilify Bitcoin. It's like, right, but eventually the good old financial system that we all have gets used.
Well, and it's also because it's so visible, it's what gets reported on. So of course,
Right.
as there's sort of this strong availability heuristic here or bias that's going on. Whereas it's very difficult to go dig through layers of shell companies in the Cayman Islands or in Dubai, and you can read different SDN designations from OFAC, and you can see how much investigative work they had to go in to find the two guys in Dubai who were helping the Russians set up this complicated arrangement to import night vision optics or whatever. And then we saw another Wall Street Journal article looking at how they were able to identify the use of Tether to help facilitate similar imports. But in the same way, there was vastly less investigative effort required to just identify the use of these on-chain assets to procure these parts. So in a sense, from the security perspective, would you prefer if all the bad actors were using crypto versus what they were using before crypto?
Yeah, I mean, again, going back to my earlier comment that if somebody were to use, a self-custody wallet with an over-the-counter trainer, with Monero, with a mixer, with rapidly using a DeFi protocol to rapidly switch between assets, that does make things very hard. But again, that's very technically complicated. But actually, interesting. Going back to your Dubai question, yes, it does. When you hop between countries, it does make your investigations much longer. But I think I recently had for an article I wrote, had to go through VARA with a fine-tooth comb, and I think that is such an interesting case of using clear regulation and clear legislation as a competitive advantage versus I think when you listen to traditional money laundering stories, there's jurisdictions that use low visibility as a competitive advantage. I think that's something that between Dubai and South Korea and MICA in the EU and then legislation coming out of the UK, I think you are starting to see this wave of countries using clear and reasonable legislation as a competitive advantage. And I mean, at some point, U.S. has got to get on the boat.
Excellent. I think that's a great place to end. Thank you, everyone. We'll wrap it up.